A businessman abandons his wife in the desert, and she is rescued by an Arab prince. After that, her life changed forever. Emma gazed out the small window of the aircraft and held her breath. She had never seen anything so majestic and imposing. The desert stretched endlessly before her, alive and pulsating, conveying both a sense of peace and mystery. She turned her face, eager to find the same fascination in her husband's eyes. But William Aragon, impeccable in his linen suit, didn't even lift his head from his phone. His fingers glided over the screen, alternating between messages and emails with a look of sheer boredom. "Did you see this?" Emma asked, unable to hide the excitement in her voice. "It looks like another world." William took a deep breath, clearly irritated, and muttered without looking up from his phone, "It's just sand." Emma's enthusiasm wavered. It was no surprise that William was more interested in business than in the scenery. He had always been this way, pragmatic, straightforward, with no space for sentimentality. But this time there was something else, a colder, more calculated detachment. It was as if he was there only to play a part, waiting for the right moment to act on something he had already decided. The plane smoothly touched down on the runway, and minutes later, the door opened, allowing the scorching heat to envelop them. The dry air seemed to suck all the moisture from their bodies, making each breath a conscious effort. Emma blinked against the intense brightness, while William hurried down the steps, not waiting for her. Outside, a group of men in white robes and traditional headscarves observed discreetly, while a hotel employee held a sign with William's name on it. A black car waited with its engine running, ready to take them to their destination. The drive to the hotel was silent. Emma tried to make small talk a few times, mentioning the exotic beauty of the city, but William responded with monosyllables, his attention fixed on his phone. He was there physically, but his mind seemed miles away. When they arrived at the hotel, one of Riyadh's most luxurious, they were immediately escorted to the presidential suite. The room was stunning, wide windows offering a panoramic view of the city, refined furniture in neutral tones with gold details, and a soft carpet that muted each step. But none of this dissipated the discomfort Emma felt. As soon as they entered, William left his suitcase in the corner and started to remove his jacket. "I need to take care of a few things. I have a meeting in a bit." Emma frowned. "I thought we were going to spend some time together. You said this trip would be special." He let out a short, humorless laugh and adjusted the buttons on his shirt as he walked past her. "It will be, Emma. I just need to handle some business first." Business. Always business. She watched as he walked away, grabbing his phone again, completely ignoring her. The click of the door as it closed behind him echoed like the emptiness she felt inside. She stood still in the middle of the room for a long moment, absorbing the crushing silence. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran her hands over her face, trying to shake off the unease that had been growing in her chest. In recent months, William had been more distant than ever. He no longer touched her with affection, showed any interest in her opinions, or made an effort to be present. Their marriage had become a formality, a cold relationship sustained by appearances. But if he wanted a divorce, why not just say it? Why this strange game of indifference and calculated closeness? The day dragged on. Emma tried to distract herself, but even surrounded by so much luxury, she felt isolated. William returned late at night, exhausted, barely exchanging words with her before collapsing into bed and falling asleep almost instantly. The next morning, when Emma awoke, she found William already dressed, drinking coffee on the balcony. He looked at her and for the first time in days, smiled. "I thought we could do something different today." She blinked, surprised by his sudden change in mood. "What?" "A desert tour." Emma's eyes widened. "Seriously? You hate that kind of thing." He shrugged. "I want this to be something unforgettable for both of us." The way he said those words sent a shiver down her spine. Unforgettable. The way he held the cup, his gaze fixed on her, his voice intentionally calm. There was something off. But Emma wanted to believe. She wanted to think that maybe this was a gesture to reignite whatever remained between them. Maybe he was trying to save their marriage, to do something special. She took a deep breath and smiled back. That sounds like a great idea. She had no idea that this trip would change her life forever. The heat of the desert was like an invisible weight pressing down on Emma's shoulders as the off-road vehicle made its way over the dunes, leaving civilization and any semblance of safety behind. She tried to ignore the unease building in her chest, telling herself it was just anxiety about the unknown. But there was something in the air, a palpable sense that this day would be different. The sun beat mercilessly in the cloudless sky, tinting the sands with golden and orange hues. The hot wind whipped against her face, carrying the dry scent of the desert, the promise of adventure. William sat beside her, but, as always, he was distant. His eyes shielded by sunglasses, his arms crossed over his chest. "Incredible, don't you think?" Emma ventured, trying to draw him into the enchantment of the scenery. "Yes," William replied flatly. His response was short, indifferent, and unsurprising. She had grown used to his coldness. Over the past few months, it seemed like her husband was always elsewhere, mentally checked out, as though she had become a burden he was carrying out of obligation. But this time, there was something else. A calculating look in his eyes, a silence thick with intent. The group of tourists trailed behind in 3 vehicles. The lead guide, a middle-aged Arab man, gave brief explanations about Bedouin culture and the vastness of the desert. Emma listened attentively, but William's mind seemed miles away. After nearly an hour of travel, the convoy stopped at a strategic spot for a break. There, between the tallest dunes, a small shaded area had formed naturally in the sand. Everyone got out of the vehicles, grateful for a moment away from the blazing sun. The guides handed out water bottles, and some of the tourists took photos. Emma walked toward one of the smaller dunes, feeling the hot sand sink beneath her feet as she marveled at the endless stretch of desert around her. That's when she noticed William speaking in low tones with one of the guides. At first, she didn't pay much attention, but something in their body language made her narrow her eyes. William spoke quietly, but his hand gestures were firm. The guide nodded a few times, exchanging a subtle look with one of the drivers. The conversation was quick, lasting only a few seconds. William then slid a hand into his pocket and discreetly handed something to the man, a bundle of cash. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Before she could react, William turned and walked back toward her, his face as impassive as ever. "Are you enjoying it?" he asked. Her voice came out hesitant. "Yes, it's all so beautiful." He smiled vaguely, grabbed his water bottle and took a sip as if nothing had happened. Soon after, the guide announced that the group would continue the journey. The tourists returned to the vehicles, and the convoy resumed its trek across the dunes. The rhythmic motion of the car and the sound of the engine masked what Emma still didn't know would be the greatest betrayal of her life. The landscape around them began to feel strangely repetitive. The dunes appeared taller, more isolated. Something had shifted in the route, but Emma, lost in her thoughts, didn't immediately notice. It wasn't until they stopped again for another break that something inside her flickered with a silent alarm. She stepped out of the vehicle and looked around. The sun scorched her skin, and the horizon stretched endlessly before her. The wind kicked up little clouds of sand, making the grains stick to her sweaty skin. She turned to look for William. He was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, scanning the surroundings. The vehicles were moving again. They were leaving. "Wait!" she shouted, running toward the tracks that were beginning to fade in the sand. "Wait for me!" No one looked back. She ran toward where the cars had been, but all that remained was the overwhelming silence and the vastness of the desert. The shock hit her like a ton of bricks. William had left her there, alone. Her lungs seemed to collapse, and a cold panic spread through her body, despite the sweltering heat. What had he done? Why? She tried to search for some logic, some explanation, but all she could hear was the wind and the frantic beat of her own heart. She fumbled for her phone with trembling hands. No signal. The desert had become her enemy. What had once seemed fascinating now felt like an unforgiving abyss. There were no landmarks, nothing but the ever-shifting sands, as if the desert itself wanted to erase her from the world. She walked. She screamed for help. Her voice was swallowed by the emptiness. Time passed cruelly. The scorching sun drained her strength. Her water was running low, and each step became more difficult. Her lips began to crack. Her skin burned. A terrifying thought began to take shape in her mind. What if no one ever found her? That's when she heard it. The sound of hooves cutting through the sand. Emma raised her face, her vision blurry from exhaustion and the blinding light. On top of a dune, a figure appeared against the golden sky, a man on an imposing white horse. He descended slowly, approaching without haste, as if he had all the time in the world. His traditional attire fluttered slightly in the wind, and his dark eyes studied her with intensity. Emma tried to say something, but her dry lips could only form a raspy sound. The man dismounted gracefully and knelt beside her, inspecting her with careful attention. His face was strong, weathered by the sun, yet there was an intriguing calm in his expression. "You're safe now," he said, his voice deep and tinged with an Arabic accent. Emma blinked, trying to stay conscious. Safe? Would she ever feel that way again? Before she could say anything, exhaustion overtook her, and everything went dark. "If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel." The first thing Emma felt was the soft touch of cool fabric against her sunburned skin. Then the smell, an intriguing mix of tea, spices, and something slightly woody she couldn't quite identify. The sound of water flowing somewhere nearby was faint, almost like a whisper within the fog that surrounded her exhausted mind. She opened her eyes slowly. The light was dim, filtered through light fabric that swayed gently around her as she lay. Her vision, still blurry, began to pick out details in the space around her. Above her, a canvas roof supported by wooden columns. Soft, richly embroidered cushions scattered across the floor beside her. She tried to move, but her body protested with aches and pains all over. A low moan escaped her dry lips. "Don't strain yourself," a male voice came from nearby, firm but calm. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting the figure of a man sitting a few meters away. He was watching her intently, without any rush or impatience. He was tall, with striking features and skin sun-kissed from the desert. His face was strong, a short, neatly trimmed beard accentuating his serious expression. He wore an immaculate white thobe, and a black keffiyeh was wrapped around his head, held in place by a golden agal. Despite his imposing posture, there was something unexpectedly tranquil about his presence. "Where am I?" Emma managed to ask, her voice hoarse and weak. "In safety," he answered without breaking his gaze. She blinked, trying to remember the desert, the burning sun, the abandonment. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the memory of what William had done struck her like a sharp blade. "No," she murmured, pressing a hand to her forehead. The man leaned forward slightly without getting too close. "You passed out in the desert. I found you, brought you here." Emma's eyes widened as the weight of his words sank in. You You saved me. He nodded, offering no further explanation. She swallowed hard, trying to organize her thoughts. Her own husband had left her to die. The weight of this truth crashed down on her with overwhelming force. William, the man she had shared years of her life with, the man she had loved, trusted. The pain of realizing this was so intense that it made her stomach turn. Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly. He watched her for a brief moment before responding. "My name is Karim." She repeated the name silently in her mind. "Are you a Bedouin?" He didn't smile, but there was a gleam in his eyes that hinted at amusement. Not exactly. Before she could understand what that meant, a woman appeared at the entrance of the tent, carrying a tray with a small steaming cup. Karim took the drink and handed it to Emma. "Drink, it will help." She hesitated, but her lips were dry, her throat scratched. She took the cup with trembling hands and brought the warm liquid to her lips. The taste was strong, a blend of mint and spices that warmed her chest almost instantly. As she drank, her eyes wandered around the space again. It was then that she noticed, through the opening of the tent, the scene that surrounded her. Beyond the columns of canvas, there was something unexpected. Green, trees swayed gently in the breeze. A clear stream ran through the sand, reflecting the light of the setting sun. Children played by the water. Women conversed while preparing food. An oasis. She blinked in surprise. This wasn't just a temporary camp. It was a home. Where are we?" she asked. "In one of the last refuges of the desert," Karim replied. "My home." Emma tried to absorb that information. So he wasn't just a traveler. The way he carried himself, his impeccable clothes, the way others seemed to respect him. "Who are you, really?" Karim looked at her for a moment before answering. "Karim al-Zahir." The name stirred something within her. She had heard it before. The Prince of the Desert, the man who had rejected marble palaces to live among his people. Her gaze returned to him, now with a different understanding. A prince. He shrugged as if the title meant little to him. The silence between them lingered until Karim broke it with a single phrase. "You're safe now." She looked at him, and a knot formed in her throat. Her whole life, safety had meant luxury, a powerful husband, a stable marriage. But all of that had proven to be an illusion. Now, here, in the middle of the desert, in an unknown place, surrounded by people who didn't speak her language. For the first time, she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she was truly protected. The scorching heat of the day began to dissipate, replaced by the gentle breeze of the evening. The sky, once an unforgiving expanse of blue, now glowed in shades of orange and pink, reflected in the crystal-clear waters of the oasis. Emma felt the cool air brush against her skin as she walked beside Karim, her feet sinking slightly into the soft sand. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Since waking up in Karim's tent, the reality of her new life was starting to settle in. The shock of being abandoned, the uncertainty about her future, the confusion of being in a world completely different from the one she had known, all of it weighed on her. But that night, for the first time, she felt strangely at peace. Karim walked beside her with steady steps, but without any sense of urgency. Emma glanced at him sideways, trying to decipher him. He was an enigma, a prince, but without the arrogance she would have expected from someone of his title. From the moment they had met, she had sensed that he didn't act like the powerful men she had known in her old life. He wasn't interested in flaunting wealth, impressing her, or demanding anything. His presence was commanding, but without any imposition. "You seem deep in thought," Karim commented, his deep voice cutting softly through the silence. Emma hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm trying to understand you." He raised an eyebrow, slightly amused. And what have you figured out so far? She let out a small sigh and turned her gaze toward the palm trees surrounding the oasis. That you're nothing like I imagined. Karim smiled faintly but didn't press her further. He simply kept walking alongside her, as if waiting for her to say more. And she did. You're a prince. You could be in a palace, surrounded by luxury, but you chose to live here, in the desert. That doesn't make sense to someone like me. This time, he stopped. Emma stopped as well, facing him under the golden light of the setting sun. To me, true power isn't in golden walls, Karim said, his eyes locked on hers. It's in the people. She furrowed her brow, trying to absorb the meaning behind his words. I grew up in a palace, he continued. I learned early about titles, duties, and the expectations placed on someone with royal blood. But I also learned something even more important. Wealth means nothing if your people are suffering. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. When my father died, Karim's tone grew slightly heavier. I could have taken his place in the family council, accepted a life of privilege, and fulfilled my role as prince, but I chose a different path. She held her breath, absorbing every word. I chose to live among the Bedouins, my people. Here in the desert, there's something that palaces could never offer: freedom. Emma lowered her eyes, processing what he had said. Her whole life, she had believed that wealth meant security, that status meant happiness. Yet here, before her, was a man who had renounced all of that, by choice. You lost someone, didn't you? She asked, almost without thinking. Karim didn't react immediately. For a moment, all that could be heard was the whisper of the wind between the distant tents. Yes, he replied at last. Emma waited for him to continue, but Karim simply turned his face toward the horizon. His expression wasn't one of sadness, but something deeper: resignation. She didn't press. She knew how to recognize a wound that wasn't yet ready to be touched. They continued walking, the silence between them heavy with unspoken meanings. It was then that Karim stopped once more and looked at her in a different way. If you weren't William's wife, who would you be? Emma blinked, surprised. The question hit her like a blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in her life, she realized that she didn't know the answer. Who was she, after all? She had always been William's wife, the perfect woman for a successful businessman. Her marriage had defined her identity for so long that she had never stopped to think about who she was outside of that. Her silence was enough of an answer for Karim. Here, titles and status don't matter, he said. Only the truth of who you are. Emma felt a tightness in her chest. She had spent years shaping herself to be what William wanted, to fit into his world. And now, far from everything, far from expectations and obligations, she realized that she didn't know who she truly was. Without saying another word, Karim gestured for her to follow him. They walked to a quieter part of the oasis, where the sand stretched out like an endless carpet. The night had already begun to take over the sky, and without the artificial lights of the cities, the stars seemed infinitely brighter. Emma raised her face, fascinated. The sky was immense. Every star seemed to pulse as if it had a life of its own, and for the first time she felt her own insignificance in the face of the vast universe. Karim watched her in silence. In the desert, he said softly, there are no walls, just the sky and the sand. Everything is real. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She had never been so far from everything she knew, but paradoxically, she had never felt so much like she truly belonged somewhere. What will happen now? She asked, her gaze still fixed on the stars. That depends on you, Karim answered. Here, No one can decide for you." She turned her face to him. For years, she had lived according to William's plans, following a script written by someone who had never cared what she wanted. And now, for the first time, she had a choice. The phone rang in the presidential suite of the hotel in Riyadh, breaking the comfortable silence of the room. William, sitting at the dining table, lazily scrolled through his phone with the indifferent expression of someone who had already gotten exactly what they wanted. With one hand, he grabbed a glass of whiskey and took a slow sip before answering. "Yes?" On the other end of the line, an Arabic-accented voice spoke quickly. It was the desert tour guide. William pressed his lips together, already imagining what was about to unfold. "Mr. Aragon, there's a problem. Your wife, she's disappeared." For a moment, William said nothing. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if processing the news with shock and disbelief. But deep down, he was only wishing the call would end quickly. "What do you mean she disappeared?" he asked, his voice shifting to the exact tone of concern and disbelief that any desperate husband might have. The guide explained the situation briefly. The group had continued their journey, and when they returned to the hotel, they noticed Emma was missing. The staff had tried to contact her, but the desert wasn't a forgiving place for those who got lost. "We've made initial searches, but time isn't on our side. We need reinforcements before—" The man hesitated. "Before they found her body," he wanted to say, "before it was too late." William rubbed his temple with the tips of his fingers and got up from the chair. He walked over to the large window of the suite and stared down at the sparkling city below. His reflection in the glass seemed like the face of a truly shaken man. But the truth was that this phone call had only confirmed what he already expected. Emma wouldn't survive in the desert. Sooner or later they would find her body covered in sand, and then he could go back to his life, free of the inconvenience of a divorce and without having to share his fortune. Still, he had a role to play. "This is unacceptable." His voice grew louder, heavy with feigned outrage. "How could you lose my wife? I pay for a high-quality service, and you let this happen?" The guide murmured apologies on the other end, assuring William that they would do everything to find her. William threw the phone onto the table with a heavy sigh. Now the performance would begin. He ordered the hotel to mobilize a search team. He called influential contacts and hired helicopters. He reached out to the most experienced guides to survey the dunes from the air. The desperation in his voice was so convincing that anyone would believe he was about to break down. But inside, all he felt was boredom. In the end, it was all just a well-rehearsed show. The desert would swallow Emma, and he would return home as a heartbroken, inconsolable widower, free. However, when he got into the helicopter, something began to bother him. As the aircraft ascended, revealing the vast golden dunes below, William felt a pinch of irritation. The desert was vast, uncontrollable, a true abyss. What if Emma was still alive? He furrowed his brow and shook the thought away. No, it wasn't possible. The heat, the dehydration, the cold of the night. None of these factors worked in her favor. He knew Emma. He knew she wasn't a strong woman. She would never survive alone out there. But what if? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The hum of the helicopter's blades was all he could hear as his eyes scanned the endless stretch of sand below. Time passed, and there was still no sign of Emma. The search continued for hours. Nothing. When William returned to the hotel, irritated and exhausted from keeping up the charade, he found one of the guides waiting for him in the lobby. The man seemed hesitant, as if he had something important to say. "Mr. Aragon, one of the merchants at the market said he saw a woman who looked like your wife." William narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "He swears he saw her at a nomadic camp, traveling with a group led by Prince Karim al-Zahir." A cold shiver ran down William's spine. The name made his stomach churn. He knew Karim. Every businessman in the Middle East knew him, the rebellious prince, the man who had rejected palace luxuries to live among the Bedouins, leading his tribe like a true leader. No, it couldn't be. Emma was dead. Or at least she should be. But if that merchant was right, if she was alive, if she was under Karim's protection. William's blood ran cold, not just because his plan had failed, but because he knew exactly the kind of man Karim was. If Emma was truly with him, then her death was no longer a certainty. And worse than that, for the first time, Emma might be in a place where William could no longer reach her. The evening painted the sky of the oasis with golden and orange hues, while the soft breeze swayed the leaves of the date palms. Emma sat near the crystal-clear spring, watching children run and laugh as women chatted in the distance, preparing the evening meal. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. But that tranquility was brutally interrupted. The sound came first, a deep, metallic rumble that cut through the serene silence of the camp. The engine of a car. It wasn't common for vehicles to arrive here. Most of the nomads used camels and horses to travel through the desert. Emma turned her head, a confused frown on her face. Other members of the tribe also stopped what they were doing, alert to the approaching noise. The dust kicked up by the tires arrived before the car itself, a shiny black SUV that clashed completely with the surrounding environment. As soon as the vehicle stopped, the door opened and a man stepped out. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The setting sun outlined his silhouette with cruel perfection. The immaculate suit, the quick, arrogant gestures, the look of someone who had always had everything under control. William. A cold shock coursed through her body. Her fingers instinctively gripped the fabric of her clothes, as if trying to find something to hold on to. And then she saw him. William slammed the car door shut and walked with firm steps toward her. His gaze burned, not with relief but with pure frustration. He hadn't expected to see her alive, and worse than that, he hadn't expected to see her different. Emma didn't stand up. She remained where she was, motionless, as if she were rooting herself to the spot. "Are you all right?" William's voice cut through the air, heavy with false concern. Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked at him as though seeing a ghost, but not out of fear, out of disbelief. After everything, after the sand burning her skin, the excruciating thirst, the certainty that she was going to die alone, he still had the audacity to ask if she was okay. Her eyes narrowed, her throat tight with a whirlwind of emotions. Before she could say anything, a movement beside her caught her attention. Karim. He was there, silently observing, his expression serious and unreadable. Unlike William, his presence didn't demand space. He didn't force his authority. But no one could ignore him. His black keffiyeh fluttered lightly in the breeze, and his dark eyes were fixed on William, not with rivalry, but with an analytical curiosity. He knew exactly the kind of man standing before him. William shot a quick glance at Karim before returning his focus to Emma. His face was rigid, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I came to take you back," he said, his voice lowering slightly, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Emma felt a wave of irony rise within her. He spoke as if she had simply gotten lost and was waiting to be rescued, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't abandoned her to die in the desert. She stood up slowly. "Take me back." Her voice was low but firm. William's eyes flashed with impatience. "Yes," he continued, ignoring how Karim crossed his arms and how the members of the tribe began to gather, watching the scene. William didn't care about any of that. He just wanted her in that car, back to the life he had planned for them. "I missed you," he said, stepping forward. This time, Emma didn't back down. "Missed me?" she repeated, her words thick with disbelief. "Before or after you abandoned me to die?" William's face contorted for a moment, as if he had been struck unexpectedly, but he recovered quickly. Emma, it wasn't like that. We were fighting so much, and I acted in the heat of the moment. But you know I love you. She shook her head slowly. No, William, you don't love me. You never did. The silence between them grew heavy. Karim stood still, not intervening, but Emma knew that if William tried anything, Karim wouldn't hesitate to step in. What do you want me to say? William asked, his voice rough now, losing the conviction it had held before. That I'm sorry, that I realized how much you mean to me. I realized, Emma, and now I'm here. I'm taking you home. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the warm desert air fill her lungs. For the first time, she realized something she had never considered before. The choice was hers. For years, William had made every decision for her. He decided what they did, where they lived, who they interacted with. But now, standing in front of him, with the desert vast around her and Karim silently by her side, she understood. She had a choice. I can't go back, she said, her voice unwavering. William's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? She lifted her chin. I'm not going with you. The silence that followed seemed to swallow everything around them. For a moment, William seemed genuinely lost. He hadn't expected this. To him, Emma had always been an extension of his own life, a controllable detail. But now, in front of him, she was someone else. He clenched his fists. The meticulous, calculating man was about to lose control. You don't know what you're saying, he insisted, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty it had before. Emma took a step back, a small gesture, but one that sealed her decision. Yes, I do. For the first time, I know exactly what I'm saying. The silence that followed Emma's refusal was almost deafening. The wind blew through the dunes, raising a thin curtain of dust around them, as if the desert itself were enveloping them in this decisive moment. William stood still for a moment, his face contorting in an expression that shifted between shock and barely contained rage. He licked his lips, as if trying to process what he had just heard, then took a step forward. Emma, please. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. You can't be serious. She held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. For the first time, William seemed smaller in her eyes. I've never been more serious in my life. He rubbed his face with his hands, taking a deep breath. He was trying to collect himself, find the right words. I know I made a mistake, he started, his tone now laden with urgency. I know I did unforgivable things, but Emma, we have history, years together. We've built a life. You can't just throw it all away like this. She felt a tightness in her chest, but it wasn't guilt. It was pity. William was desperate, but not because he loved her. He just couldn't accept losing her. We had a life, William, she corrected, her voice carrying a weariness he had never noticed before. He shook his head, as if refusing to hear her. We can start over, he insisted. We can make it work. I can change. You always wanted me to be a better man. I'm willing to be that for you. Emma blinked slowly, absorbing his words. If she had heard them months ago, maybe she would have believed. Maybe she would have clung to the illusion that William could change, that there was something left to save between them. But now she saw clearly. He didn't want to change. He just didn't want to lose control over her. Karim remained by her side, silent, his eyes fixed on the exchange, but not intervening. His presence was a quiet support, not demanding, but constant. He wasn't pressuring her. He simply waited, knowing that this was her decision. William took another step closer, his face hardening. I missed you, he said again, his voice now tinged with frustration. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had heard this before, his apologies, his promises, his assurances. But now, standing here, looking into his eyes, she knew the truth. "Did you?" she whispered, her voice steady. "Did you miss me? Or did you miss having someone who obeys you, who fits into the life you've already planned?" William's face twisted in anger, but for a brief moment, she saw something else there. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing the image of her he had built. He took another step forward, his jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake," he said through gritted teeth. "You don't know what you're doing." Emma didn't flinch. She held his gaze, unshaken. "No, William, I know exactly what I'm doing." The silence that followed seemed to hang between them like a weight. Finally, William stepped back, his eyes darkened with a mixture of fury and defeat. He was no longer the man in control, and he couldn't stand it. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the SUV. The engine roared to life, cutting through the stillness of the night. He slammed the door shut and sped off, disappearing into the endless desert. Emma remained still, watching the dust settle in the wake of his departure. The weight of years of submission, of living under his thumb, lifted off her shoulders with each passing second. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of liberation. Karim, who had remained silent, now stepped closer, his presence grounding her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his eyes studying her closely. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the stillness of the night around them. The stars above seemed brighter, more alive, as if they were witnessing her moment of clarity. She took a deep breath, the air of the desert filling her lungs, and when she opened her eyes again, there was a calmness in her gaze. "I'm free," she said quietly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Karim gave her a knowing nod. Without words, he extended his hand to her. Emma hesitated for only a moment before reaching out to take it. The warmth of his hand was a silent promise, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She was free, and for the first time she truly felt it. The roar of the engine still echoed through the oasis, and the dust, kicked up by the tires of William's SUV, floated in the air, slowly dispersing. Emma remained motionless, watching the vehicle disappear into the horizon until there was nothing left but silence. The weight of the moment still pressed against her chest, but it was a different kind of weight. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret. It was a strange emptiness, as though a part of her life had been ripped away and left a blank space. William was gone, and with him, the past that had held her captive. She closed her eyes for a moment and inhaled deeply. The warm desert air filled her lungs, bringing with it the scent of spices and dry earth, a smell that was beginning to feel familiar. But even with the certainty that she had made the right decision, an unsettling thought began to form in her mind. Now what? She had broken free from William, but what did that mean? Was she truly free or just lost? Did she truly belong here? "Are you all right?" The voice was soft, gentle. Emma opened her eyes and found Karim standing beside her. He didn't ask out of politeness or obligation. He asked because he genuinely wanted to know. She turned to face him and noticed something curious. Unlike William, who always demanded immediate answers, who pressured her to act according to his desires, Karim simply waited. There was no expectation or demand in his eyes, just patience. "There's no rush," he said, his tone calm. Emma looked away toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to sink behind the dunes, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The heat of the day was giving way to the coolness of night. There was no rush. For the first time in a long time, no one was pushing her to have all the answers. She nodded slowly, and Karim didn't say anything else. He simply stood by her side, offering quiet support. His presence was reassuring without the need for words. As Emma glanced around, she realized that the people of the oasis were still there. They had watched everything, but without judgment, without interference. No whispers or disapproving glances. They simply accepted. An older woman, dressed in a blue robe, adorned with delicate embroidery, approached. Her face was weathered by time, but her eyes held a kindness that warmed Emma's heart. Without saying a word, the woman placed a gentle hand on Emma's arm and smiled. That simple gesture carried a profound meaning. Emma didn't need to explain anything. She didn't need to justify her pain or her decision. She was accepted, and that was more powerful than any words could express. Feeling the emotions still surging within her, Emma let her feet guide her. She walked toward a group of women gathered near the fire, preparing the evening meal. They worked with practiced hands, chopping vegetables, kneading bread, stirring large pots over the flames. The aroma was comforting, a mix of spices and human warmth. Without thinking too much, Emma crouched down beside them. A young woman looked at her with curiosity and, without hesitation, handed her a bowl of dough. Emma hesitated for a moment, but then took the bowl and began to knead the dough, feeling its soft texture between her fingers. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but no one corrected her. No one tried to teach her with impatience. They simply let her be part of it. In the distance, children ran and played, their laughter filling the cool evening air. A young boy with dark hair and bright eyes ran past her, waving, a mischievous smile on his face. Emma smiled back. Life went on. Time in the oasis seemed to flow differently. There were no clocks rushing the day, no schedules packed with unmissable appointments. The sun rose and set at its own pace, and no one tried to hurry it along. Everything had its proper moment to happen. At first, Emma found it strange. She felt restless, as though she was wasting time by not always being busy. For years, her life had revolved around goals, deadlines, and meeting William's expectations. Now, with no one dictating what she should do, without the need to please or prove herself, she didn't quite know how to act. But the answer came naturally. The people of the oasis simply lived. They took care of what was needed, without anxiety, without rushing. Each task had a purpose, and every small action was part of something greater. Slowly, Emma began to adapt. One morning, she awoke to the first rays of sunlight, painting the sky in gold. The sounds of women talking already filled the camp, along with the smell of fresh bread being baked over heated stones. Emma rose, adjusting the light cloth that had covered her through the night, and stepped out of the tent. Children were running between the trees, playing without a care, while the men organized themselves for another day of hunting and trading. Without thinking, she walked toward the women who were preparing the morning meal. At first, her presence was only met with curious glances, but no one pushed her away, no one questioned her place there. They simply gave her space to learn. A woman with strong, dark features handed her a piece of dough, indicating that she should knead it. Emma hesitated, but then took the dough and mimicked the careful movements of the woman. Her fingers sank into the soft texture, and for the first time she felt satisfaction from something so simple. For years, everything she touched had been associated with luxury, fine fabrics, expensive jewelry, flawless furniture. Now her hands were covered in flour, and yet she felt fulfilled. Another woman approached, carrying a clay pitcher. She offered it to Emma, who quickly understood. Emma took the vessel and walked to the well, feeling its weight against her body. When she drew the fresh water from the depths, she glanced at her reflection in the clear surface. Her hair was messier than she was used to keeping it, her skin was darker from the sun, and there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. The wife of William no longer existed. Now, she was just Emma, and that was liberating. In the distance, Karim watched her. He always did, silently, without interfering. He had seen her transformation unfold, day by day, without comment. Emma felt his presence even without looking at him. The Prince of the Desert didn't treat her like someone fragile or a responsibility. He let her choose her own path. And every day, The distance between them seemed to close, imperceptibly. There were no words exchanged about it. It was in the small details, the lingering glances, the mutual respect, the way Karim always seemed to know when Emma needed space or company. It was different from anything she had ever felt before. One afternoon, as she helped hang fabrics to dry in the sun, Emma noticed Karim talking with a group of men. They appeared to be discussing something important, and the way the others listened attentively made it clear how much respect they had for him. Emma couldn't help but think William would never have mixed with people like this. Her ex-husband had always needed to assert himself through power, influence, and money. Karim, on the other hand, didn't need any of that to be respected. His mere presence was enough, and that was what made her feel something she had never felt before: security. Not the security of a bank account full of money or a convenient marriage, but the security of being with someone who didn't want to shape her, who didn't want to possess her. Time in the oasis followed its own rhythm. The sand beneath Emma's feet was cool, a strange sensation after the scorching days under the desert's blazing sun. Night had fallen over the oasis like a silk veil, bringing with it a deep silence and a sky dotted with stars. Above them, the infinite expanse stretched out without limits, unhidden by artificial city lights. She walked beside Karim with no specific destination, just following the peaceful rhythm of their steps. The wind blew softly, ruffling the edges of the veil she wore loosely over her shoulders. For a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the scent of the desert, the cool breeze against her skin, the distant sounds of camels moving through the camp. She didn't need to speak. Neither did he. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was an understanding. Since William's departure, Emma felt like she was relearning how to breathe, relearning how to exist without the constraints that had always held her. But there was something more in the air that night, something that vibrated between them. Karim stopped at the top of a dune, and Emma followed suit. The landscape around them stretched endlessly, bathed in golden moonlight. He looked at her with such intent, as if seeing her in a way no one else had. "What do you really want, Emma?" His voice was low but firm. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight. For the first time, someone wanted to know what she wanted, not what they expected from her, not what they decided for her. What did she want? She tried to find a rational answer, something safe, something that made sense, but nothing seemed right. Her gaze wandered to Karim, to the strong and serene features of his face, to the dark eyes that held her without haste or pressure. He didn't need to say anything for her to understand that here, with him, she was free to be whoever she wanted. And then, before she could think, before she could calculate the consequences, she whispered, "This." Karim furrowed his brow slightly, as though making sure he heard her correctly. But Emma didn't wait for him to ask. She took a step toward him, her heart hammered in her chest, but not from fear. It was different. It was something that made every cell in her body vibrate. She slowly lifted her hand, hesitating for only a moment before touching his face. Her fingers brushed against the roughness of his short beard, feeling the warmth of his skin. Karim didn't pull back. The world around them disappeared. There was no desert, no past, no future. There was only that moment. And then Emma leaned in. When their lips met, it was as though something long dormant inside her awoke. It wasn't a hurried kiss. It wasn't impulsive. It was recognition, a meeting of souls that had finally found each other. Karim gently cupped her face, as if touching something precious. There was no urgency, no possession, only the certainty that this moment was real. Emma closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away. For the first time, there was no fear. When the kiss broke, she slowly opened her eyes. Karim was watching her silently, his breathing still heavy, his gaze full of something deep, intense, undeniable. And then, without needing to say a word, Emma smiled. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what challenges would come or where the desert would lead her. But she knew that she wanted to live it by his side. The nights in the desert were long and silent, marked only by the sound of the wind sweeping through the dunes and the rustling of the date palm leaves in the oasis. Emma lay on the soft cushions of the tent, watching the faint glow of the lantern beside her, letting her thoughts wander. She didn't do this often, but occasionally she still thought of William. There was no pain, no anger, no regret. What had once been an unbearable weight was now simply a distant memory, a story that no longer defined who she was. William was a part of her past, but no longer her present, and certainly not her future. She sighed and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the scent of spices mix with the coolness of the night air. Time moved differently here. There were no deadlines, no suffocating expectations, no constant judgment from her ex-husband. In the oasis, things happened at their own pace, and with each passing day, Emma felt stronger. By morning, before the sun had fully risen, she was already awake. The days in the desert began early, as the intense heat of midday required work to be done intelligently. At first, everything had felt like a challenge, walking on the sand without tiring, carrying heavy water jugs, helping set up tents when the strong winds threatened to blow them down. But with time, her body had learned the right movements, her skin had adjusted to the sun, and her eyes had begun to see the signs she had once ignored. Now, she could recognize when a sandstorm was approaching. She learned to differentiate the sounds of the wind and interpret the flight patterns of the birds, which signaled the presence of water nearby. She discovered that the desert, though seemingly inhospitable, was always alive and moving. Emma had never imagined she could feel so at home in such a challenging environment. One particularly hot afternoon, she sat in the shade of one of the oasis trees, watching Karim feed the horses. He did everything with patience, never rushing, as though even the simplest tasks were a sign of respect for the life he shared with the animals. She studied him with curiosity. Karim never spoke of grand promises. He never tried to impress her with empty words. His love was in the small gestures, the way he always noticed when she needed a moment of rest, how he encouraged her to learn without pushing her too hard. He never promised her kingdoms or riches, but somehow his silence offered something much more valuable, the certainty that no matter what, she would always have a place by his side, if she chose it. "You're watching too much, Emma," Karim said without looking at her, his tone light with amusement. She smiled, realizing he already knew she was there, just trying to understand how you managed to be so patient with everything. Karim shrugged, finishing tying the reins of one of the horses. "The desert teaches patience. It doesn't obey anyone's will. You can fight against it, or you can learn to live with it." Emma stayed silent, absorbing his words. Yes, the desert taught patience, and she was learning. But it wasn't always easy. There were days with sandstorms, when the sand invaded everything and tents had to be reinforced. Nights when the cold cut through the skin, as relentless as the scorching heat of the day. Periods of water scarcity, when each drop had to be rationed carefully. But in none of those moments did she feel weak. On the contrary, Emma realized now that she had never been so strong. Beside Karim, looking at the golden dunes stretching as far as the eye could see, she felt like a part of this place. Not because she had to, not because anyone expected it, but because here, for the first time, she had found something she had never had before: belonging. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty. The oasis wasn't just a refuge, it was home. The wind gently blew through the dunes, carrying with it the scent of warm sand and dry palm leaves. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold, reflected in the tranquil waters of the oasis. Emma walked slowly, feeling the cool sand beneath her feet, her light dress brushing against her skin, her heart beating in a peaceful rhythm. She looked around, absorbing every detail of this place. The distant sound of children playing by the spring, the murmur of women talking while preparing the evening meal, the smell of food blending with the fresh breeze from the desert. For so long, she had searched for meaning in places where she never belonged. And now, without effort, without trying to adapt, she felt she was finally a part of it. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty for what she had left behind. There was no regret, no sadness, no resentment, only gratitude. Gratitude for the path that had brought her here. Gratitude for surviving. Gratitude for discovering who she really was. She thought of William, but his name no longer carried weight in her heart. He was part of her story, but not her present. There was no more pain when she remembered him, only the certainty that he belonged in the past. She stopped beside one of the trees and placed her hand on the rough bark, feeling its texture beneath her fingers. There was something symbolic in the gesture. The desert was a relentless place, but also full of life for those who knew how to see it. That's when she felt a presence near her. Karim. He didn't need to announce his arrival. Emma recognized his presence before she even saw him. He walked until he was by her side, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands crossed behind his back. They stood there for a few moments in silence, watching the sun sink behind the dunes. Karim had always known how to respect the timing of things. Finally, he broke the silence. "Are you thinking about what you left behind?" Emma took a deep breath before responding. "Not exactly. I'm thinking about what I've found." He turned his face to her, studying her closely. "And?" She smiled, feeling the lightness of the answer. "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm running from something." Karim nodded slowly, as though he had known this even before she admitted it. "True love doesn't trap you. It sets you free," he said, his voice calm. Emma turned to him, surprised by those words, not because she didn't believe them, but because she had never heard them spoken with such conviction. For so long, she had thought that love meant dependence, that it was necessary to sacrifice pieces of herself to keep a relationship intact. But now, she understood that wasn't the case. She smiled. "I think I'm only now truly understanding that." Karim didn't respond, but a small smile curled his lips. He reached out his hand and Emma, without hesitation, took it. The warmth of his fingers against hers was firm and comforting. A silent promise that, no matter what came next, she wouldn't face it alone. But the future didn't scare her. She didn't know what was to come, or what challenges lay ahead, but that uncertainty no longer weighed on her, because for the first time she was exactly where she was meant to be,